Welcome to the CEC Report for the 20th of February 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick and with me today is Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, 1 year after Nazi coup in Ukraine, Anglo-American coup-backers closer to goal of world war. And secondly, Aussie banks double derivatives bets since GFC. So firstly, 1 year after Nazi coup in Ukraine, Anglo-American coup backers closer to goal of world war. Now, just to give some of the background for newer viewers and people who don't have the full picture, the 20th of February, today, is the first anniversary of the massacre that occurred in the Maidan in Kiev, which marked the finalisation of a coup d'etat against an elected president of Ukraine. The coup d'etat and the rallies in the Maidan, if you could call it that, were led by neo-Nazi mobs in actual fact, which we exposed at the time, including direct heirs of Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian leader who supported Hitler's invasion of Ukraine and committed genocide against their own people on his behalf. Now, the lead up to this coup was funded and was encouraged by the US government, and they admitted sinking $5 billion or more into this process over previous years leading into that.
That's $5 billion, not $5 million.
That's right.
That's a huge amount of money.
That figure was admitted by the Assistant Secretary for State to Obama for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and she then played a crucial role in setting up the new post-coup government. She chose her man Yatsenyuk as the new Prime Minister to run the government. The coup organisers and leaders of these paramilitary and Nazi mobs were thereby elevated to top positions within the government. And even Obama actually admitted recently on CNN that the US set up the transition which brought this new government into power.
I think, Elisa, the real issue here was at the time when the President and Ukraine were actually negotiating with the Russians to join a common market with the Russians, as opposed to what was being also promoted at the time, that Ukrainian join into the EU. Now, not become part of the EU, but join part of their trading bloc. And what became obvious was that if that happened, Ukraine would lose enormous amounts of its actual industries, its agriculture, to free trade. So the president said, put the brakes on this, we're not going to do that. We're going to look towards Russia, which has historically always been, well, they were part of the Soviet Union, so they've had historical long-term relationships with Russia. And once that happened, and this was just not tolerated, and that's when this coup was accelerated, and you saw the horrendous scenes of, these neo-Nazis in the street, and it's been openly admitted, funded by the West in order to overthrow an elected government.
That's right, yep.
But the issue is the movement towards Russia.
And aligning with Eurasia and what we now see as the emerging BRICS bloc of nations. Now the good news is there's been a process towards, as you've probably heard in the media, a ceasefire, which initially has held, there's been various transgressions of it, which is normal. But the best part of the process was the fact that the European leaders, particularly the President of France, Francois Hollande, and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, were reacting to the threat of global thermonuclear war coming down on their heads. Because basically the big discussion that had been in progress in the United States was arming with lethal weapons for the first time the Ukrainian army. So if the US were to do that, of course, how would Russia react? And the European leaders could see this could not end in anything good. And so they proceeded to get the Minsk discussion back onto the table. The US and UK were not involved. It involved the French, Russian, German leaders together with the President of Ukraine. And these were 17-hour-long discussions, and it took longer because President Poroshenko of Ukraine refused to meet with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. So in the end, Putin basically said, look, I'll talk to them privately, and he did so, and that was how they were able to come to a arrangement.
I think that's a very important point, Elisa, because the way the media portrays Putin, he's in control, this is a de facto war run by Putin through those eastern parts of Ukraine, and that's simply not the case. I mean, here you have a sovereign peoples being subjected to by these neo-Nazi forces, say we're not going to have this. So there's an uprising there based upon the fact that they want to support their own rights and so forth. And in many cases, Putin doesn't have as much power as people think that. Of course, he has a voice, but he doesn't have as much power as people think that he has.
No, exactly. And the reaction to this peace process was very interesting, because on the first hand you had the various Nazi and paramilitary groups in Ukraine that said they just rejected the ceasefire altogether. They said we will not hold to it. Dmitry Yarosh, who's the right sector leader for one, rejected the agreements as against the constitution. The former deputy commander of the Azov battalion vowed to defy the Minsk Accords, so they were basically deliberately setting out to sabotage it by breaking the ceasefire.
And of course, the leaders of those in eastern Ukraine are hearing this, they're knowing this. This is the nature of the enemy, that this insurgency that was put in there by the US, openly admitted. So they know this. So how is a ceasefire supposed to exist when you have this type of these type of announcements?
Yeah, and those Nazi assets, those groupings, they have the official backing basically of the US government. Now Nuland herself, the Secretary of State for Europe of the United States, she also attacked the peace process in private, albeit, at the Munich Security Conference on February the 15th. It was reported in Der Spiegel that she told a group of US diplomats and senators to, quote, fight against the Europeans, unquote, on the issue of arming Ukraine in order to fight Russia. And she called the meetings, the four-way meetings that took place for the ceasefire, Merkel's Moscow junk and Moscow's BS. So you can see here who is trying to stop that peace process moving ahead. Now the other thing that's clear, and the media is therefore beating up the risk of the ceasefire not holding. You see that they're really not contributing and not helping the situation, because the US is adamant that they want to move forward. They hope that it fails, basically, and they want to move forward to arm Ukraine.
See, Elisa, people are saying, well, why is this happening? Why
do they want that?
Why do they want this war? Well, there's an insane element in the United States that believe that they have the capability to win a thermonuclear war against Russia. I mean, Russia has 8,500 thermonuclear warheads. The United States has about 6,500 nuclear warheads. And even to think about getting into that geometry is the height of insanity. But this is what these leaders inside the US, typified by Victoria Nuland, actually believe, that the US can win a thermonuclear war against Russia.
And I mean, they're pushing it because their system, the Anglo-American system, is collapsing, and they're threatened by the newly emerging BRICS block of nations that want to dump the policies of free trade and so forth that have put us in this position, dump globalisation, go back to sovereign banking principles that will allow us to rebuild economies.
And this, as you say, this is on the back of what's taking place in Greece right now. Greece is calling for a global debt conference. You know, it's actually saying we can't pay this debt. There's been all sorts of frauds perpetrated. They're pushing towards what we've been talking to on this program called Glass-Steagall, which is the actual separation and breakup of the large banks, protecting the commercial interests of those banks and getting rid of the speculative junk, which I think we'll talk about later in the program. But the point is that this is the directionality that some of these countries are going, and the desperation of the transatlantic system because of its bankruptcy under all the speculation is what's driving this war push.
Yes, but as I mentioned, the US is going to keep pushing for this war. Now, on that front, Andrey Perubi, who is a Ukrainian, he's a radical Banderite and a senior member of Yats's political party, he's going to go, he might even already be in the United States. If he's not, he'll be there soon, to discuss the provision of highly precise modern weaponry. And I want to just mention, because you see the fraudulent means by which they're stoking this war, that US Senator Jim Inhofe, and he's the guy who introduced the bill to arm the Ukrainians with lethal weapons, was forced to admit on the 11th of February that photos that were provided to him by a Ukrainian delegation were fakes, and we'll show the photos on the screen, which purported to show Russian military columns entering Ukraine in late 2014, but were actually from 2008 in South Ossetia. during the Russia-Georgia conflict. And there's another second set of photos which are similar, which were recently shown on a major German TV station, which have been shown as fakes as well. Three members of the delegation that provided him the photos were leaders of paramilitary units fighting in southeast Ukraine, two of whom were elevated to Parliament when Nuland appointed Yats's government. Now, after the break, we're going to come back and keep discussing this subject and then move on, as you said, to the economic questions. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So we're talking about the 1-year anniversary today of the coup d'etat against the Ukrainian government, and we were talking about the US role, particularly in stoking this up and also to break the ceasefire, the tenuous ceasefire that is now in place. And one thing I wanted to raise, there's been a number of very, prominent figures, including from the United States, that have spoken out against the way the US is handling this crisis. I mean, for example, I don't know how long it's been since Obama has spoken to Putin, and when Angela Merkel travelled to the US just a week or two ago, one of the things she insisted upon is that he speak to Putin. And he did. They ended up having quite a lengthy conversation after that, but it had been a long time where there was no communications. The so-called red telephone between the military and presidential leaders is not in existence any longer. And one figure who brought this up is the former US ambassador to the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration, Jack Matlock, and he addressed the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. on the 11th of February. He, of course, opposed sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. He said only more Ukrainians will die as a result of that. He went through the history of the Cold War and how the US and NATO broke their promise to Russia, to the Soviets, of not expanding NATO. And more importantly, he contrasted Reagan's diplomacy to what Obama is doing, and he referenced a handwritten memo that he'd read. This was written by Reagan before the first meeting he had with Gorbachev, in which he talked about keeping a dialogue open, establishing trust, and, quote, not beating them up on human rights, unquote. And Matlock said that in contrast, Obama's policy is an autistic foreign policy. They're not even communicating. You also had the former head of NATO's military committee, General Harold Kujat, who said that the road to a political solution now also depends on how America behaves in this situation. So that's really a very key factor.
I think it's very interesting, Elisa. If Obama was really concerned about peace, why wouldn't you talk to another head of state?
Yep.
Why wouldn't you open the dialogue to say, well, how do we resolve this situation? He shut it off. Putin hasn't shut it off. So therefore you have to say, well, why is Obama doing this? Well, Obama is doing this at the behest of the British, of the financial oligarchy, the British Crown, in order to provoke a war. And that's a hard reality for most people to understand. But given the fact that when you're looking at the collapse of the transatlantic financial system, you can see why that motivation would be very real. There's a real threat of loss of political power here to the new alliance of the BRICS nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, as well as Argentina and a whole host of other countries that are now orientating around a new economic policy. And that new economic policy is anchored on the idea of sovereignty, national sovereignty, which is what Russia actually implicitly represents. So does China. They have a deep sense of their own right to self-development. Now that has to extend, as far as what we've been talking about, into the necessity of national credit, so having a nationally sovereign-run banking system, not this succubus of the British-run financial monetary system over the top of everything, but you actually have national credits and credit systems created, like we actually did have in this country through the likes of the Commonwealth Bank. So each country has its own sovereign credit. You then have fair trade, where you establish bilateral trade agreements, as is being happening with the BRICS, on the basis of mutual benefit. Not this British free trade, where you have merchants and third parties like the banks brokering deals so that the people get screwed and they get the profits as part of private institutions, private merchant-based institutions. So this is what's up for grabs here. And therefore, and there's these insane elements which Obama, the narcissistic personality, represents, that are heading up this potential, this real potential of blowing up the world into a genocidal war of extinction through the use of thermonuclear weapons. They don't care. They would rather say to themselves, let's blow up the world and disappear with it, than actually fight for peace. And when you see Obama saying to Putin, I'm not going to talk to you, then you see that policy coming through in spades.
Exactly. And I think another window into it, which clearly shows the difference in thinking, is the Eurogroup has offered a large bailout package to Ukraine, the second package in less than a year, where they've pledged at least $2 billion in direct aid, participation in an additional $17.5 billion IMF loan. Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, actually recommended that this be a total $40 billion package. And this is to a country, Ukraine, which its economy is contracting at 8% per year, near 30% inflation rate, and is completely bankrupt. So compare that to the complete refusal of the Eurogroup to do anything to deal with Greece's situation. And in fact, one of the other things for Ukraine that was pledged from the Eurogroup and IMF was a write-down or a write-off of their debt, which is exactly what Greece is demanding. And in Greece's case, the answer from all of the European authorities, IMF, etc., was a big fat no. You can't, quote-unquote, violate the rules, they were told, in a dozen different wordings. So you have to ask why the distinction between treating Ukraine this way and the way that they're treating Greece.
Well, that's because of what's happened in Greece, and then you have members of the Greek Parliament that are saying we have to go with Glass-Steagall.
Yeah.
That's a policy that's represented directly by the Schiller Institute, which is a fellow institution with us. And what's happening with that is now we're getting slandered.
There was an article in Die Welt of 15th February headlined Greek Poltergeist, and this was written by a Hungarian aristocrat and a friend of Prince Charles, Boris Kalnoky. And he said that the new Greek defence minister, Panos Kamenos's ideology, which he shares with the other leaders, Tsipras and Varoufakis, he said, quote, "It looks like it was taken directly from the publications of the Schiller Institute. Such ideology is centred around a rebirth of the Silk Road, that is, trade routes between Asia and Europe."
So the message is getting through.
Exactly. So they know that this is coming, and they also know that Glass-Steagall is in the policy platforms of both the independent Greeks, which Kamenos heads, and also of Syriza. So this is a big discussion that's breaking out, and in fact we'll talk about this a little bit more in the final segment when we come to Australia's economic situation. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Aussie banks double derivatives bets since GFC. And so, of course, we've just been talking about the economic dilemmas in Europe and the fact that there's concern that Glass-Steagall might come forward. But let's look at the situation here in Australia. Our economy supposedly withstood the 2007-2008 GFC quite well, but that doesn't account for the state that we're in now. And another window into what's really going on, where the only money that's being spun is coming from gambling, basically, speculation, is that the Australian banks now have $27 trillion invested in derivatives, which is double what they had at the time of the global financial crash. And of course, this is part of $2 quadrillion approximately of derivatives contracts worldwide. And look, this is what caused the GFC. Remember, subprime mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, Lehman Brothers. I mean, it's now double as bad here in Australia. Craig, what are derivatives for those new viewers who don't know, and how do we stop them?
Well, Elisa, derivatives are basically financial instruments that derive their value from something else. Now, that can be something that's real or some sort of a cash flow, right? Like, the classic form of a derivative used to be the futures, where, for example, you could contract to a market like wheat and say, in 6 months' time, I will sell my wheat to you for $300 a tonne. So in 6 months' time, you have to sell that wheat for $300 a tonne. But you can possibly sell that commitment to someone else, right, if you wanted to. In other words, you still have to deliver on that product, but you can sell that commitment. So here we have a piece of paper with a commitment on it that you can then trade. And that's what a derivative is. So when you're talking about this 27 trillion, you're talking about the banks have $27 trillion of something with value, whatever that is. That might be loans, whatever. Maybe it's got no value, we don't know. That's the problem. It's called fog wealth. That's what King O'Malley used to refer to these things as, fog wealth, because no one really knows. Warren Buffett used to call them, weapons of mass destruction, because again, no one knows. And my question is, why does this gap keep going up, to 27 trillion? Why isn't there a reduction? Why can't we? The problem is that even the banks themselves are very, very secretive about these things, because it is fog wealth. It is purely speculative and completely unnecessary if we had what we call for, and it's a Glass-Steagall policy, where you only allow the banks to the commercial banking side, that is the real and necessary bankings that we have in our economy for the funding of the physical economy and the provision of financial services for the physical economy, are not allowed to speculate or use these sorts of speculative instruments. So that's what the Glass-Steagall is about.
And that would begin to unravel this big bubble. That they wouldn't be able to get access to the kind of initial funds to begin to invest in that by basically looting the economy and the peoples and pensions and.
Well, there's a great deal of money to be had here in terms of the speculation, because the returns on these things can be absolutely enormous. And that's what the problem of the banking system is that you can't have a system in banking where you have this desire, this hunger for speculation built into the actual need for the development of the physical economy. And that's why the Glass-Steagall calls for the separation of the commercial banking system from the merchant investment speculative side of things.
And we have to do it now. I mean, we should have done it in 2008. Bankers should have gone to jail, as they did after the 1929 crash. And in fact, in Iceland, they've just made decisions that have jailed 4 bankers for 4 to 5 years for their role in the crash of the Kaupthing Bank in 2008. And in fact, this is part of quite a large attack upon major banks worldwide. You've had the HSBC Bank in trouble for the tax evasion, setting up of accounts under fraudulent names, and their offices in Geneva have just been raided by Swiss authorities. And the former chief of protocol from UBS has actually come out in France now, revealing the names of hundreds of unregistered account holders in Argentina, doing the same as what HSBC were doing. And she said, look, this is what all the banks do. It's a dirty business. We have to understand that we are dealing with a criminal industry.
Back before 1990, before Alan Greenspan legitimised derivatives, Elisa, these things were considered criminal instruments. They were actually illegal, right? And they were legalised in the 1990s and have absolutely exploded because they are literally the equivalent of gambling debts. They've got nothing to do with the real economy. And the destruction that we see in the economy today is because the banking system is hooked on these gambling debts, on these speculative debts.
I mean, could you imagine what $27 trillion would mean if we put it into the real economy, major infrastructure projects to really get this economy, Australia's economy, back on track?
Well, that's what's necessary.
Absolutely. Now, you can read a lot more about that, all the detail of that. If you ring in, we'll send you a free copy of our weekly newsletter, the Australian Alert Service. So be sure to do that and find out more information by going to our website. Thanks for tuning in to the CEC Report this week. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome. And I do have to emphasise a lot of material that we cover on this program, Elisa. It's important that people follow up on our website or getting our publications. It's
written up, it's all available, so get a hold of us. And join us again next week for the CEC Report.